All right, guys, let's get started. For the sake of time, I'm going to start recording. Juan and Fabian, if you guys could turn your cameras on. Let's see if they're already on. All right. Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us for the CNU Florida Young Leaders session. Today, we're calling it The Power of Zoning. And we've got two very powerful guests, Juan Mullerat from Pluserbia Design, as well as Fabian de la Espriella. He also works with Pluserbia, but he has his own firm called Urbe Studio. And we're going to talk a little bit more about all things zoning, mobility, planning, urban design. And I want everyone to just, feel free to jump in, drop some questions in the chat. If you'd like to speak up and unmute yourself, please feel free. Just let me know. I think this is a great opportunity to speak with some high-level professionals in our new urbanist and planning, multidisciplinary development world. And I'm just very glad and grateful for Juan and for Fabian for joining us. So zoning is something that affects all of us, as we all know here. That it's a lot of people don't know what zoning is unless you're in the planning, in the planning world or in the development world, and it affects our lives in every single facet, in my opinion. It creates either senses of place or senses of placelessness. I think it's Andres Duani who says that sprawl is pretty much nowhere, and he goes in deeper into all of that. But I'd like to start off with asking a question for Juan. Juan, I know you're from Barcelona, and for me, I know a lot of people know that that's where I went to graduate school at the University of Barcelona, and just living there for 9 months turned me into an urbanist. So I can't imagine you, growing up in Spain, especially in Barcelona. How do you think that shaped you into who you are today, and getting you into this work that you're working on?
Thanks, Andres. Hi, everybody.
Yeah,
it's a good question. I think that you had more benefits than I did because I lived there before I was 14, and at that time, zoning, or I guess exclusionary zoning, was just the pantry where I could not go at home. That was exclusionary zoning. That's as much as I knew about zoning. But all jokes aside, I think Barcelona shaped my thinking about urbanism and urban design more so than planning and zoning, at least at that early age. It does inform a lot of the ways that I see placemaking and context sensitivity. For those of you that have visited Barcelona, while you may picture Barcelona as the big Cerdà blocks, it also has very interesting villages that were annexed into the city over time. And so if you visit Barcelona, I encourage everybody to not just, and you wouldn't, visit the Eixample, but also those villages that grew organically. And I think that's the beauty of Barcelona, is the edges of where the Eixample meets the original cities or the original villages and the old city. There's a fantastic book by Oriol Bohigas, who was the city architect during the Olympics. And there's a book called The Reconstruction of Barcelona, and he talks extensively with regards to how the city evolved, why everything between the villages was vacant and empty for centuries, and how the Eixample began to cure and fill in that very vast space. So in short, I think Barcelona has many lessons. For me, it was more about the placemaking, because at that early age, I didn't know anything about planning or zoning.
Awesome. Fabian, I know that your background is from Colombia, and every time I think of Colombia, I think of the buses because they have an incredible way of incorporating buses and actually making it bus rapid transit. Well, in Miami-Dade County, we have high hopes of being able to do that, but Colombia is actually well versed in that. I'm pretty sure. I think it's called El Transmilenio, if I'm not mistaken. Correct.
Right.
So, can you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about how maybe Colombia impacted your vision for mobility and the reason that you're into it?
Thanks, Andres,
Yeah.
and hello, everyone. So it's true, grew up in Colombia, but more importantly, I grew up in Cartagena, the
Mhm.
Indias, which is a Spanish colonial town. And so similar to Juan, I think growing up um, in a city with a very intricate fabric with um, paved, cobblestone streets and narrow streets with historic buildings that frame the streets very well. It just walkability in that sense. I think without knowing, again, growing up, but I think it ignites a sensibility of place. And I think Cartagena did that for me, and just the sense of feeling safe on a street, walking around, and so that sense of walkability, I think it's rooted in growing up in Cartagena. Now, Bogota and their journey with Transmilenio started, I think, I guess, in the early 2000s. So they've been down this path for 25 years now. And I only lived in Bogota a short period of time, and they were just when I was leaving Bogota, they were just opening their first their first line. I was able to see the impact. Of course, all we heard at that time is that, oh, they're copying, the model that was laid out in Curitiba in Brazil, which was a great model to follow. And I think Bogota, with all the good and bad that they've done through the years, it's been also a model beyond South America for sure. Like you said, Miami, it's trying to pick up on those places that have implemented BRT. And even though Transmilenio for Bogota doesn't seem to have not fixed everything from a mobility perspective for
Mhm.
sure, it definitely improved. It provided like rapid transit in the good sense, because we've got transit in Miami, but I guess it's not in the same efficiency that can be understood. So I think that it's very positive, and what happened there is that Transmilenio in Bogota kind of ignited that I guess interest in improving mobility and having a logical system, and so other cities have replicated Transmilenio. Um, not in the same scale, because Bogota, it's a monster of a city, but
Yeah.
they've learned from the application in Bogota, and they've replicated that. So it's been a great path that they've been on in trying to provide better infrastructure for people to get around.
It's awesome. So I'm gonna start asking both of you and kind of bounce around more questions, more specific questions. And again, I encourage everyone, especially the ones who just joined us, to ask questions in the chat. And also, if you'd like to ask a question and turn on your camera, please feel free.
I'll leave the tough
So
ones for
Juan,
Fabian.
go ahead. What did you say, Juan?
I'll
I'm sorry.
I'll leave the tough ones for Fabian.
Yeah. So this one is for you, actually, Juan. I know that we actually talked about this recently. The Dolphin TOD, the Dolphin Station Transit Oriented Development, is the largest in South Florida, and you're working on it. You were the master planner behind this transit oriented development. What are some things? Because now that we talked about bus rapid transit, what are some things that you made sure to implement in this TOD? It's And can you tell us a little bit more about that process of working on the largest TOD in South Florida's history right now? I think is a groundbreaking thing. But most people, when they think of the Dolphin area, the Doral, the Sweetwater area, they don't really think of, as it being transit connected. Can you talk to us a little bit more about, what your vision is of how this can connect, and improve the east to west corridor connection within Miami-Dade County, and I guess the whole idea behind it being a walkable pocket on the outskirts of the county.
Sure. So just to clarify, it is the largest because it's greenfield, right? So it's got the headlines because it's all built anew. But I mean, to me, and I think that probably everybody on the call agrees that the largest, most impactful TOD is all the work that's being done in downtown and in places where there's density, where the impact is going to be much greater for many more people. And while I'm very proud of the work that we did for Dolphin, I really do think that there's other infill work that is just as important, even if it's sort of like a 50 by 100. I know, for instance, Carrie Penabat and Adib Kure are doing some amazing work in Overtown, and they are, just infill projects. Okay, but if we're talking about, greenfield, yes, it's the largest. I think that, as planners and urban designers, after a while working on our project, we know the challenges and the shortcomings more than the successes. I think that because if you're in this industry, you are somewhat of a perfectionist, and you always know that a project is never finished.
Yeah.
The reason why the project came about, it was because it was private. It was a P3. It was an RFQ that went out, an RFP that went out, and the land is public, and so that takes away some of the costs of building something like that. And I think that's also key, because South Florida, the land values are just too high for a project of this magnitude. So once that is put aside, then it is the challenge is to work with the developer to ensure that you educate and help steer the development in a direction that is transit oriented. I can tell you there's some shortcomings in that project, in my opinion. I think that they provided way too many parking. I can tell you that the parking was driven by the financing more than the developer. So you can't just blame one single party. And I think that it could have been a lot denser, but then again, as planners and urban designers, we're looking at 4 years in advance, and so it's difficult for developers to look that far ahead. And when the project is led that way, then they are looking at what the market can absorb in the short term, rather than what it can become in the future. So our plan actually looked at a full build out, and then it was dialed back into what could be absorbed, and in turn, that absorption was then divided into phases, for again, to ensure that the project would be feasible. So whatever you guys see being built right now will probably feel underwhelming compared to what it will be once all the phases are there, and compared to what it should be in 30 to 40 years in the future. The project in itself is visionary, and I have to give credit to the developer, because it looks at TOD as a vehicle for development, which is it's not as unusual anymore, but back when we started doing this, it was. In fact, a few developers turned down several TOD projects, and now they're kicking themselves for not having gone after them. Not in this location, in other locations in South Florida. But I think that we have all been quite successful, and not just our firm. I'm talking about planners in general in South Florida. We've been quite successful educating the public on the benefits of public transportation. And while it might not work still. And it's not what we are used to in Curitiba or Cartagena or Barcelona or you know or even Atlanta. I think that in Atlanta they have better service than us. But we've come a long way. So I think that it was visionary from a developer. I think that there's shortcomings. I think that there's other TOD projects in the pipeline and being built right now and have been built right now. For those of you that have been here for more than 10 years, US1 is not what it used to be. For good or for bad, right? So there's more traffic, but there's also more development. There's more use of the metro rail. So again, I think that our project is just one more drop in the bucket for Miami to become truly a city that is multimodal and that is serviced properly. And the question always for this project is, what's first, density or transportation? In the case of the metro rail, it was always metro rail first and density will come. Well, we're seeing it happening. In the East-West corridor, which was first envisioned and worked through by the TPO, which was the MPO and now is the TPO, as the East-West corridor of the SMART plan. That was also set as, let's do a transportation project and the density will come. Well, lo and behold, the projects are first, right? We're seeing, even though there's even though there's BRT happening on the 836, the service is very limited. And so I would say that actually the project comes first. So I'm encouraged by that. And I think that we're going to see more in the years to come.
Awesome. Fabian, a question for you. So when it comes to connecting sprawl to more sprawl, you're pretty much thinking of creating some pockets of urban centers and finding a way to make the corridors multimodal. I know you just recently did something with Broward mobility plan. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what you've been working on there?
Yeah, so the Broward MPO, through the Safe Streets for All grant program that has been going on for a couple of years, many cities have taken advantage. Although the emphasis or the focus of these programs is to enhance safety. So many cities have kind of jumped on the wagon of Vision Zero, and I think we go back maybe 10 years ago, some cities started adopting at a policy level Vision Zero, and at the federal level with this push with the Biden administration, they provided this funding for cities to take that policy that some have had adopted to action. And so it provided the opportunity for places that had already established a Vision Zero goal, or at a policy level, a desire to establish 0 deaths by X year, to go deeper in terms of developing action plans and strategies and speed management measures and so on and so forth, so that they could actually track and measure progress over time. And so that's what Miami-Dade County has also just recently completed, a Vision Zero action plan. But that's what we did with the, and we are currently working on the Broward MPO safety action plan. So it's a huge project, and there's been many pieces to it. Quick build, it's a piece, neighborhood safety, lighting, technology, school zones. And so because of the very comprehensive nature of this approach, not every agency that gets funding, through the SS4A program gets to, I guess, develop such a comprehensive approach to their safety action plan. I guess Broward County has been very lucky to have the resources to put forward that many pieces to their plan. But at a minimum, when cities, and we're seeing a lot more municipalities, even in Miami-Dade County, now getting the funding to be able to at least have a safety action plan where they not only establish those goals at the policy level, but they have very clear strategies for speed management to handle safety around schools. And, so where do they have the greatest impact? And one of the key pieces that SS4E funding provided, which is no longer in place, but it's the whole equity component. So it was a very big push of this program to make sure that underserved communities and families were actually a priority, to make sure, because there's a disproportion of how the impacts are, I guess, balanced in cities, and that's been proven through research and data. So I guess the goal is to make sure that people in those underserved areas they get killed more. So I guess it's a bit of a zip code effect. You live in areas where some better things happen, and then some not cool things happen as well. And it's so trying to minimize that zip code effect.
So you mentioned a lot of things that I want to double click on. So we'll be back to you.
Sure.
Juan, when I think of powerful zoning districts, I think of your work with NRD1 and NRD2. And when I say the word powerful, it's because if you go to Wynwood, it looks like it's just one gigantic construction site right now. And it looks completely different than it looked 15 years ago or 5 years ago, or even a year ago. There's a lot of quick change happening. And if you ask me, it's in large part due to the two districts, the NRD1 and the NRD2. Can you tell us more about how you were able to work on those, powerful districts, and how you think of that word revitalization, as opposed to just straight gentrification? Can you talk about how you were able to revitalize these areas, but do it in a way that you included the community?
Sure. Loaded question. I thought
Yeah.
the difficult ones were gonna go to Fabian, by the way, but anyway.
He's gonna get some tough ones pretty soon. But
all right, good. So I really can't talk about the NRDs unless I talk about the Miami 21, right? So we are incredibly fortunate to have what I call an operating system, which is the Miami 21 that DPZ did back in 2010. And one of the main authors is here on the call. So we are extremely fortunate because we have an operating system that is flexible, clear, and it incorporates to some level a vision for a city. Now, in speaking with some of the authors, the Miami 21, just like any code, it's not supposed to be a static code, right? It's not written in stone. And it's supposed to evolve over time to adopt and to address the needs of the city. And the Miami 21 did not include, well, it included the NCDs early on, but it was a blanket code, a code that blanketed the entire city for many reasons. The worst one of which was the politics, because as planners, we need to make sure that we are putting together regulations that are that work for all, and so we have the politics get involved because we have to negotiate things. But it was never intended to be always that blanket code, and it was never intended to be a static code. And so once it was done, and we began working on the NRD, we realized that there were some need for revitalization rather than conservation. And by the way, NRD stands for Neighborhood Revitalization District. NCD is Neighborhood Conservation District, which was intended to work in tandem and in support of historic districts, or districts that were contextually in need for something, for an overlay. And in places like Wynwood, there was limited conservation that that was to happen. So the identity they wanted to keep, the arts, the vibe, really. I mean, I think that vibe is what describes it best.
Yeah.
And so with Francisco Garcia, who was then the planning director, we said, well, how about NRD? Let's invent something new. It's not too far off from what already exists, and let's use the same structure that the Miami 21 already had of the NCDs to create an overlay that would encourage revitalization. And we did that with the leadership of the community, which back then was limited to some residents in the Northeast Quadrant and, more than anything, the property owners, the commercial property owners. A little something that not many people know, but those property owners actually agreed to reduce their height and trade it for density, which was, I mean, to me, I had never seen that before. When has a developer given up something, right? At the end of the day, they have to meet their bottom lines and all that. So that was very interesting, and partly, it was because the current zoning back then was D1 and D2, and that was limited to work, live, and live works. And so that's how it came about. The other reason why the project came about was because one of the most loved destinations in Wynwood, which is Panther Coffee, was illegally roasting coffee. That was considered an industrial use in the city's eyes, and it was in a T50, which was 2nd Avenue. And so it was funny because everybody went there for the coffee, everybody went there for the murals, and both things were being considered illegal. The murals, by the way, at one point, the city considered them signage, and they were not supposed to be that big. They needed to follow the signage ordinances in the Miami 21, which limited them to, I forget, but it's something like 2x4s, 2 feet by 4 feet, and so the reasons why Wynwood was special were all non-compliant. And so there was a need, again, to shift and change and adapt that neighborhood into the code in a way that it would allow it to evolve the way that it wanted to. And that's really how the code the overlay came about, the NRD1 came about, because of, again, visionary property owners and developers that knew that they had to make some trades. And there were many challenges on the way. One of them biggest ones, and I don't think it has been solved even, I think it has been solved somewhat, but not really, is the lack of open space, which an industrial district doesn't need and a mixed-use district does. And it's very difficult to recapture open space on land use that has already been designated for development. And if you want to know, that was done in several ways, or is intended to be provided in several ways. One is a privately owned open space, and the other one is through the streets being the open space, the public space, the public realm, right? And there have not been built yet, but they're in the pipeline. There's 3 wonders that are intended to come online. There's also the paseos, which reduce the distance of the blocks. Again, many things that already the original Miami 21, the operating system that allows our zoning to work, already had in their language. We just adapted it to meet the needs of the neighborhood. And if you want, I can leave the whole question about gentrification to Fabian, which I'm sure that he would love for me to pun it over.
What I would
Juan,
love
it's up
to
you.
point out here, it's I love the idea or the fact that Juan brought up the whole notion that there's pieces that are considered illegal in our environment, and that it's something that constantly happens, and it's part of how we as a profession and how cities are evolving. Like in the early 2000s, the roasting coffee, it's one example, but we can see it also in Wynwood and in other areas, Little River, for example, the microbreweries. And then we can think about the CrossFit studios. Like these things were not coded anywhere, right? And so that's part of, in these last, 15 years, and we can go back and back, but in the last 15 years, we've seen those changes happen so that we can allow for those uses that didn't exist before. So my point here is in to the topic of this conversation, the power of zoning, it's that keeping that flexibility to allow for that innovation in our cities, right? And these transitioning districts like Wynwood and others are often where these pseudo-industrial uses that were by Euclidean zoning perhaps called industrial, but they don't no longer kind of fit that name. And so that's where the microbreweries, and so cities have to be creative on how they start using a label to start breaking that mold and unpacking those uses into a different format that fits the urban environment. And so I'm very glad that we
But
touched on
from
this.
from a regulatory standpoint, you do need labels, right? Because you need to make them fit somewhere. So for instance, and just to close the loop, the Panther Coffee now has a use which is which we invented for specifically this issue, which was manufacturing enabled retail. Something that didn't exist, partly because the comprehensive plan is very clear. Something's commercial, something's industrial, but this was sort of like a mix of things. And manufacturing enabled retail was anything under 20, I believe it was 20,000 square feet, because also they didn't want big boxes, that where things are manufactured with the condition that there is a retail outlet. So that could be your shoe repair shop or your roasting or your brewery or your, again, as long as it's less than 20,000, and that where there is an industrial operation, a manufacturing operation, but with a retail outlet. That was the way that we resolved that one. And again, it was, my God, it's 10 years ago. Yeah, so that's how we solved that one.
Got it. So I have a question from one of the young leaders. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, what are the potential impacts of eliminating single-family zoning on housing affordability, particularly in high-demand neighborhoods?
Wow, it's a great question. I think that it could go both ways. In high demand areas, I think, of course, when you go and work in a community and try to say that you're going to um, uh, creep into single family neighborhoods, it's almost a no-no. Like you'll get a lot of opposition. But in terms of affordability, the fact that going back to the what's considered illegal in many areas in our city, it's illegal to do duplexes or triplexes or multi-family, but not in the scale of Brickell multifamily, but what we're calling missing middle, right? And so where can we create spaces for missing middle to be legal and where it's necessary? So when we can get away with offering options or areas where we can provide for that transition, I think it works to the advantage of housing affordability. I don't want to call it affordable housing, but housing affordability. And we should be, as planners and urban designers, pushing towards that end to grow those areas where that missing middle can actually happen. And so it depends how you creep into these single family neighborhood or zone districts. You can creep into them, allowing for that transition between a mid-rise and a single family house to be somewhere where we have those apartment houses and duplexes and anything in between that allows for a multifamily product, that it's not one versus the other, right? The tall high rise versus the single family home. And I think that's where we're lacking a lot in many of our cities.
Definitely agree. Aki, do you mind asking your question
Sure.
yourself? Anybody else?
Sure. So question for Juan and Fabian. Could you just Juan, or in this case, Juan specifically, Juan, could you discuss your experience on the Miami 2100 task force? I know that you were a member on the panel. I took the time to watch the entire discussion because I found it kind of fascinating, the back and forth, and you had some pretty influential people on that board. So I was wondering if you could just sort of discuss maybe your impressions of it. But, that being said, I find it kind of concerning that even though that report was commissioned, as far as I can tell, there hasn't really been any real discussion on the dais about it at all. And I don't really know of any plans for implementation. So maybe you as a board member could tell us a little bit, about your experience, but also why, in your opinion, there hasn't really been any path towards implementation or any of the recommendations, or they've been very piecemeal as far as I can tell.
Yeah. My recollection is difficulty sleeping, stomach aches, and yeah. So that board, that task force was put together because the commission felt that the Miami 21 needed a large overhaul. And I feel like that was one thing that was said in public, but then I think that both the commission and staff felt that that overhaul was dangerous unless it was done in a very careful way. And I think that we all understand that zoning is effective when it creates when it creates predictability, right? So we needed to be conscious of that when proposing change, and I think that the makeup of the board was the reason why the outcome was the way it was. We proposed many things, right? From affordability to ADUs to, I remember pushing ADUs a lot, and I remember that we discussed a lot of the things that I was told originally. I contacted the original authors of the Miami 21, and I kept on asking, what was the intent of this? What was the intent of that? And a lot of the great intents, the great intentions, some of the great intentions that were put into the first drafts of the Miami 21 didn't go through, partly because the Miami 21 was working with an existing fabric and certain rights. And partly because, again, it was politics, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you need these things to go through, and so you need the votes and all that. And so the Miami 21, the way that it was approved was not the original pure, and that's okay. That's the way things are. And little by little, it has changed. So what we were proposing in some of those meetings, some of the things that I was proposing, I believe, I didn't check afterwards, but I did get informed first, and then I made those proposals again, like the ADUs, the T5Rs, with no ADUs, that were sometimes, and sometimes it wasn't the code, sometimes it was the atlas, the zoning. They were applied in places like Little Havana or Shenandoah, where there's a lot of ADUs, right? So when the Miami 21 was approved, suddenly all these ADUs were non-conforming. Anyway, to make the story short, I think, I know that some of the proposals that we made in that board have been and are being implemented slowly, like you said, piecemeal. They understand the intent and the intention. I know the planning department knows those shortcomings and those changes that the city requires. And we personally I know our office and other offices have been working into implementing some of those proposals through NRDs and through changes to the NCDs. Most recently, we worked on the West Grove, and some of those proposals for the West Grove have also been slowly approved piecemeal. So you asked me how I felt about it. I'll tell you how I feel about it. I feel a little disappointed, and yet I know that it was a necessary step. And I think that little by little, the Miami 21 will continue to adapt. It just takes time. I mean,
Yeah.
regulations take time, and unfortunately, we're always playing catch up. But that's what it is, right? The market runs much faster than we can change regulation, and that's not just Miami. That's just everywhere. And we just hope that we can put regulation that is flexible enough to change as quickly as it can, so that it can adapt to the changing markets and the needs, etc.
It's awesome.
Marina,
Sorry.
I don't think my answer was very direct, and I'm not trying to not answer the question, but it is difficult. I was just one vote.
Yeah, and listen, if there's no political will at the commission level to even discuss it or to present the findings to the city, even put it in front of the dais so that whoever is that it's against it can at least make their position clear.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, to me, that was a little bit more damning. I'm just like, you spent all this time making this report and you don't even want to discuss it. It's a bit odd to me.
Thank you, Aki.
I'll say, Aki, that the political will that you just mentioned, I think it's a huge reality that us as planners have to live with. I mean, because at the end, we may get hired or brought to a city to give our best, recommendations, and
Sure.
and at the end, it's going to be up to those who are sitting at the dais to make a call. And so and they may have their own motives to go one way or the other, and it may have nothing to do with our plan. And so I think that we need to be very aware that what we're playing with, not to say that planning is a game, but it's dependent on many factors that are outside of our control.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll share a little story, and this, we worked together, Juan, on the Fort Lauderdale TOD project, right? And the city of Fort Lauderdale got an FTA, Federal Transit Agency grant back in 2016, I think 2017. And it was based because Fort Lauderdale was planning a streetcar. And when the project was initiated in 2018, I think, the new mayor came on board and they decided that they no longer wanted the streetcar because there was some other interest, other forces at the time. So, the city ended up with a grant that they had to spend, and we were hired to do a TOD study. And so basically we advanced a multimodal planning study, which was a TOD without the T because the transit was missing. So what we did was a full planning study that looked at regulations and multimodal infrastructure and so forth, so that we prepared the city with all the strategies and mechanisms that they could move forward and do a transit ready, establish a transit ready area whenever that political will came back in place, so that they could then have all the pieces and the T for sure together. But again, just to illustrate how these impacts our work in any and every way.
Thank you very much. Marina had a great question. I was wondering if she feel comfortable asking herself, or do you want me to read it out loud, Marina?
I can ask it. I don't mind.
Go ahead.
I enjoyed the conversation, and I think that the political, I can't speak enough about political will necessary to get these little interventions adopted into codes. It's nice to hear how the Miami 21 is evolving though, because there are a lot of things we proposed that 15 years ago were just not acceptable. Removal of parking in certain districts that now is, available. The ADUs, we treaded very lightly initially. Now it's much more common. So it's nice to see that it's evolved, and I'm very curious to see the NRD zoning, so I'm gonna have to go look at that. But you were speaking about densifying neighborhoods earlier, and I'm seeing here in Montgomery County, in Maryland, they've adopted a Thrive Montgomery County 2050 or something. And part of that was really trying to, it's one of the most expensive places in the country, as every place seems to be. And they've really tried to bring in more attainable housing. And it has been fought vigorously, not only here in Alexandria, Virginia, I mean, everywhere I see it, because one, people think it's too blunt an instrument and it shouldn't be applied everywhere. And we should be much more layered and thoughtful about where that happens. But the other part is that the county executive wrote a whole piece on how he really believes, and it got me thinking, he really believes that it's not going to provide for affordable housing. What we're seeing is the erosion of the character of neighborhoods that people really cherish. And so we're seeing older homes that people have lived in for 30 years being bought up for, 2-3 million, torn down. And then what gets built in its place are either duplexes or a massive McMansion or townhouses that feel a little bit out of place, and sold for a tremendous amount of money. So I know Portland's done it, probably to a degree that many other cities haven't, but I'm curious if any of you have seen it really work in a anywhere in Florida, for example, where it really has not only bought housing that is contextual to its surrounding, but being able to provide for affordable housing, whether it's through cottage courts or ADUs for that matter.
I'll take that one. It's a tough one, and because you're talking not just about zoning but also about the market, right?
Yeah.
And the market is very difficult to define, and every time you define it, it changes. So there's two things that we have proposed in the past that have not been adopted, partly because there's no political support, and they're risky. The first one is strengthening performance zoning. So and I should say, we first did NRD1, and affordable housing wasn't really a question, because in 2015, affordability wasn't really a buzzword, I guess. But then we did Little Havana, and then we started seeing how people lived and the needs. And then we did Wynwood Norte in RD2, and we incorporated some ideas about affordability, and the affordability there was, if you want a fourth floor, you must provide 25% affordable housing. Okay. And in talking to John Anderson, the master of all, he was telling me, the fourth floor is really not feasible because then you need to change your blah, 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 blah. So every time we do one of these projects, we learn a lot, and then the next project is totally different. Maybe not totally different, but we build on that. The last one, I believe, was what I think came closest to a solution, and it was not adopted fully. And what it did, this was the West Grove, and what it did is it created a parallel zoning paradigm or condition that was opt-in. So there's your Miami 21, right? And then there is your parallel Miami 21 that you can tap into if you provide affordable housing. Everything else, so everything changes, right? And by opting in, you're providing that affordable housing. What that does, which is something that we didn't achieve in Wynwood Norte, was that there was no speculation. Bear with me, there's still speculation, but there's no speculation because there's no rights given to your current property unless you opt into these conditions. And once you opt into those conditions, maybe your property values go up, and that's great. But then you're tied to that, to providing affordable housing at certain levels of AMI. if you put in those affordable housing conditions to the existing zoning as of right, then your property values change automatically whether you like it or not. But if you opt in, I believe that is one of the avenues, and I don't have all the answers, don't get me wrong, I'm not the smartest cookie in Miami, but I believe that you come closer when you have that option to build that affordable housing, and that sort of curbs some of that speculation, and also sitting on vacant property line. One last thing, Marina, and if you add to that, again, the second thing I told you there was two. If you add to that land use based taxation,
Yeah.
right, instead of right, so it's not what you build in your lot, is it's the rights that you have. We would not only curb a lot of this speculation, but we would also be building in the right places. Because I have said this publicly, and I get booed sometimes, especially not developers or property owners, but the fact that we still have vacant land in downtown Miami is beyond me.
Yeah.
Beyond me, because that pushes all development out. It creates an issue for transportation. The values of how, I mean, that to me is, I still, anyway, but that has no political backing, because it's
Traction.
not, sorry.
Can I say
Go ahead,
one thing?
Marina.
Yeah,
course.
sorry. The first part, I agree with what you said, both examples, and the second one is indeed very, very difficult to do, but it makes a lot of sense. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they have a white tax, which means if you're not building on your land, you are penalized for it. So that's another way to do it. Even though that's a country that can do things that here you can't.
Yeah.
Having said that, the first part you mentioned, I'll give you a very, very good example of where that happened, and that's Columbia Pike in Virginia, where they had very you can only do it in an area that has very low zoning attached to it, and they adopted a form-based code that was an opt-in if you want. So you can develop at your own zoning if you want, or you can opt into the form-based code, which doubled or tripled or quadrupled the amount of development they could do. And as a result, that entire corridor has redeveloped with a tremendous amount of affordable housing. So that's a very successful example of where that first idea has worked perfectly well.
Yeah.
But it can only be in a place that doesn't already have tremendous capacity. And we're always telling cities, do not rezone properties without extracting something from it. But if the zoning is already high, it's really difficult.
So let me add to that. Let me add to how it's been botched here in Miami.
Oh, yeah.
Twice, because I feel almost somewhat responsible, even though that's not what we had planned. In Wynwood Norte, we limited the size of we paired the number of units with the lot sizes, and we did that partly because we believe that density should not be parallel, right, in a gradient with the transect zones, because if you allow more density with more volume, you always get ultimately the same unit size, right? The curves are parallel. So we actually did the inverse. The smaller your lot, the more units, and there was a couple of reasons for that, and the main reason was because we wanted to see smaller buildings that were more contextual to the existing fabric. What happened is that a year and a half later, the new commissioner decided to take that condition of lot sizes out. And so everything went up to 150 units an acre. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from an architect asking me, how could I envision 150 units an acre fitting in 3 stories? And she was kind of criticizing me. And I'm like, yeah, I never envisioned that. And I explained that was literally a crossing out of the NRD2 by a lack of by a politician that I believe did not have all the information of what she was crossing out. So that was one. The second thing that I also feel somewhat responsible and it is born from one of our projects, which is the West Grove also. I don't know if you heard in the news, there's a project that is being developed in Coconut Grove with a T50 optional or T50 on steroids. I don't know what they call it these days, but there's a problem, right? Because it adds, I believe it's 2 stories or 3 stories to the T5. So that was the West Grove. That was what we planned, but we planned it with a condition. We planned it, number one, with a condition of affordable housing, and number two, within a certain distance of the metro rail station or along the transit corridor, and with a reduction of parking for the reasons that you all probably know. Those conditions were taken out, and the T50 on steroids was put in there, and so. But anyway, I think that you all get what I'm saying. You cannot provide these benefits without conditions, because then it becomes the Wild West. And I know Miami is known as the Wild West, but as planners, I think that it's our duty to protect the context and the fabric of a city.
That's awesome. I want to be respectful of both of your times. We're kind of getting to the end. Do you guys think we can do another 7 minutes? What are you thinking? Should we ask a couple more questions, or are you guys at the limit?
As
with
long as it's a tough one,
5
and
minutes.
5 minutes? All right. So
Go.
I did have a tough one that I wanted to ask you both for last. And this was about the Live Local Act. I know you guys both have strong opinions, as we all do as urbanists, that even though it does have good intentions, like Juan said in his article, and he very politically and said that, some people come into power and they think they're experts in things that they're not experts in. And I really loved the word that you used, Juan, in terms of in that article that talked about precision. So they needed to bring in a professional to be more precise in understanding how cities work and really, driving their intention. Yeah, I'll send that over. I'll send the article. But my point is, do you think a form-based Live Local component would make it better? Because I think one thing that's great is, they top it off at 3 stories if it's next to single family. I think you brought up something that's very, very interesting. The smaller the lot, the higher density you can go about. But in other words, I don't want to make it too hard, but I just want to hear your thoughts, both of you guys, your thoughts on Live Local, and what are some tweaks that you would do to improve it.
I'll say very quick. I think that what it's the nature of the beast, right? The preemption, they're trying to take that power from municipalities, and so trying to calibrate and tailor, and so it's impossible. You can't do the one size fits all type of thing that applies like peanut butter across the board, because you end up with the issues that Juan was just talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that they've built this great slogan or tagline of Live Local, it's for this. I think that there's other motives behind it, and not so good. So there's other forces, I think, driving this forward, and without the ability to that bonus or that percentage of affordable product that gets put into the market, without the proper, like we were just saying, without the proper controls at the local level and administration, because it takes for cities a lot of administration resources and staff resources to kind of control how that functions. That there's I think it's not a great recipe, and I'll pass it on to you, Juan.
I forgot what I wrote in the article, but I still support what I said, I'm sure. There's been some amendments to the Live Local. So I'll keep it general because I don't think we have to get into the details. There's some things that are great about the Live Local. Reduction of parking. right? Things that I think as urban designers, planners, lovers of cities, I think that we all love some of these things. But in general, while I am in support of parking reductions, especially around TODs,
Me too.
I'm totally against top-down legislation from Tallahassee or from whatever. I think that just like in Miami, every neighborhood is special. Just like those of us that have more than one child, every child is special, even though you love them all, they're all different. And for someone to tell you from Tallahassee what it is that you need is just ill-conceived. We based on this Live Local, we have the same regulations as Lake Wales, Florida, in Polk County. I don't know, and that's just not right. There's also, I'll tell you, there's also. I don't know if everybody knows about the Live Local, so I don't want to get into too much detail. But if you all know that Live Local, it allows for maximum density from anywhere within the municipality, and maximum height, with some conditions, but within a mile, right? So if you have the downtown within a mile, you can go to town, and then maximum density. Well, the city of Miami is the hub for all Miami-Dade County, right? So inherently, it has the maximum density and intensity and height anywhere else in the county. On the other hand, for instance, Hialeah, just to give an example, has lower height as its maximum. There's 12 stories, and their density is also capped. And so when you have legislation from Tallahassee that applies in the same exact way everywhere, it is conditioned by whatever zoning you already had when the Live Local came about. And so it's unfair. And it doesn't take into consideration what exists there. It takes into consideration, more than anything, what is regulated there. So it's about what's on paper, regulated on zoning, rather than what's on the ground. And as you all know, if you all are working on comprehensive plans, you have to look at both the future land use map and the existing land use. And if you pair both, they never match, right? One thing is what we plan, another thing was what exists there. So blind regulation, blanket statewide regulation is I believe very, very scary. And if you're more interested in what's going on, just read the paper this morning, the Miami Herald. It talks about the potential demolition of our most precious South Beach because
it's getting into historic preservation thing. Not to mention the compatibility issues that it will create, because if it start getting blanket commercial areas, including industrial areas, so you could end up with an affordable, multifamily development in an area that is surrounded by industrial or semi-industrial uses. So compatibility will and should be a huge concern as well of municipalities, which I'm sure will challenge and deal with how to calibrate all these things as they come in.
Got it. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your insights. Unfortunately, we weren't able to talk about more of the Central Florida things that you guys have done, or Hialeah, South Miami. I know you guys are working on very groundbreaking stuff. So thank you once again for joining us. I'm going to work on the recording and sending it out as soon as I can. And Marina, thank you so much for also joining us, and the rest of the young leaders. We'll talk to you guys very soon. And un abrazo a todos. Thank you. Go ahead.
Please edit all the negative comments we've had for specific people, or just those don't, make sure you edit it properly.
Yes, sir.
It was
Thanks for the invitation. It's been great seeing you all.
Got it.
Bye.
All right, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.